The dark alleys of Victorian London were not empty. They were full of people. People the city had stopped seeing. There was no screaming here, no pleading. There was waiting here. Children with faces covered in dirt and cold. Men and women broken not by blows, but by silence. Every stone on this street knew their names, but the city did not. This is not a story about pity, and not about mercy. This is a story about how easily people disappear when no one wants to look. If you are ready to walk these streets, stay, because some looks don't let go even in the dark. Entrance to a street where people are not seen. Night in Victorian London does not fall abruptly. It seeps in. Between the bricks, between the steps, between the people. The gas lamps glow dimly, not to illuminate, but to mark where safety ends and oblivion begins. We stand at the entrance to an alley that has no name. Such streets were not on maps. They existed only for those who had nowhere to go. Here you can hear no carriages. You can hear no voices from the rich houses, only water slowly running over the stone, and footsteps disappearing as if they had never been there. In these alleys, people did not ask. They learned to wait for morning, to wait for a look. Waiting for a random coin or for indifference. Children sat, leaning against the walls, as if trying to become part of the brick. Men stood still, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. Women hid their faces in the shadows, because a look cost too much. Poverty did not scream here. It was silent. And that was why it was so dangerous. Everyone who entered these streets made a choice, to look or turn away. We will not rush. We will go slowly, step by step. Because to understand these streets, you need to stop and let the silence speak first. By the middle of the 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, the city of empire, the city of factories, ports, banks, and palaces. But between these symbols of power, there was another London, the one that didn't appear on postcards and rarely made it into reports. Narrow streets where the houses stood so close together that daylight never touched the ground. Lanes where the stone was always damp and the air heavy with smoke, garbage, and human breath. This was where most of those who were called by the simple word beggars lived. But this word was too simple. Behind it lay 100 different destinies. The old, who had lost the strength to work. Wounded soldiers returning from colonial wars. Widows without a trade or support. Children born into poverty, and therefore had nothing to compare with. In Victorian England, poverty was not considered a misfortune. It was considered a sign of character. The idea was simple and cruel. If a person was poor, he was either lazy or morally corrupt. This belief was supported by newspapers, sermons, and politicians. It allowed one to look past. It allowed one to go unnoticed. Beggars were feared. They were avoided. They were considered a threat to order, not because they were dangerous, but because they reminded one of how easily one could fall. By day, they would blend into the crowd. They would sit by bridges. They would stand by churches. They would quietly reach out on busy streets. By night, the city would chase them into the shadows. The police would chase away those who slept on the steps or under the arches. Vagrancy laws allowed arrests for the mere fact of being homeless. Workhouses offered shelter, but at a price that not everyone could afford. Families were separated there. There they worked for hours for a bowl of porridge. Poverty was not cured there, it was punished. Therefore, many chose the streets, cold, dirty, but free. Children became part of this world very early. At 6, 7, 8, they already knew where it was warmer near the wall, where the guards were less attentive, and which look evoked sympathy. They did not play, they survived, and the city knew it, but pretended not to. Victorian morality demanded order, cleanliness, and silence. Beggars violated all three. That's why they tried to make them invisible, push them away, hide them between the bricks of the empire. But they never completely disappeared, because every street, every bridge, every lamppost remembered who stood beneath it in the cold. And it is from these streets that our journey begins. Not fast, not convenient, but necessary. We will not look down. We will walk alongside, slowly, in silence. Because only in this way can we hear the stories of those who were once called simply beggars. Street children, born without a chance. In Victorian London, childhood had no clear boundaries. For some, it lasted for years, in warm rooms, with books, games, and the voices of governesses. For others, it ended almost immediately after birth. A child born into a poor neighborhood did not get time to make mistakes. Its life began with cold, noise, and deprivation. And very quickly, it learned the main thing: how not to disturb the city. Poor children were everywhere, but at the same time, nowhere. They sat on stairs, hid against walls, napped under bridges, huddled together, as if this would reduce the cold. They were not counted. They were not recorded. They were rarely mentioned by name. Official reports spoke of an overpopulation, newspapers about young vagrants, sermons about the sinful origin of poverty. But no one asked the children what it was like to grow up in a city that turned its back on you. Many of them never knew their fathers. Others lost their mothers very early on, from illness, exhaustion, childbirth gone wrong. To be left on the streets meant learning the rules quickly, unwritten, cruel. Not to look the police in the eye. Not to sit in one place for long. Not to sleep soundly. Always hearing footsteps. The smallest ones worked as best they could. They shined shoes, sold matches, carried packages, and when there was no work, they sat silently, hoping that someone would stop. Children's faces evoked more sympathy, and the city knew it. That's why it was often the children who were put forward. But sympathy was short-lived. A coin was light. A glance was quick. No one stayed behind. At night, danger became closer. The streets grew dark. The streetlights left long strips of shadow between them. The children looked for places where they could not be alone. Under the stairs, in abandoned basements, near bakeries where the heat was still there. Sometimes they disappeared. They didn't write about it. They didn't announce it. They didn't investigate it. A child who disappeared from a poor neighborhood wasn't an event. Sometimes they were taken to a workhouse. There they were given shelter and food, but they took away everything else: a name, a family, the habit of being together. Children were separated by age and gender. They were taught discipline. They worked for hours. And all this under the sign of correction. Poverty was not considered a tragedy here. It was considered a mistake that had to be corrected with work and humility. Those who could not stand it fled back to the street. Because even cold freedom sometimes seemed less cruel than an order in which you are not seen. Some of the children became invisible altogether. They were silent. They did not extend their hands. They did not look. Their gaze became empty, as if the city had taken away from them not only their home, but also their expectations. Such children frightened adults because they had no request, only presence. And that is why they tried not to look at them. Victorian London was building the future of the empire. Railways, factories, colonies, and in parallel, it was raising a generation that had no place in this future. These children did not dream. Dreams demanded silence and security, and the street gave only today. Today to find food. Today not to freeze. Today not to disappear. And if they lived to adulthood, they no longer knew any other life. Thus the city created its own shadow, and in this shadow grew children, whom no one taught to be children. Work instead of childhood. In Victorian London, work was everywhere. It made noise, it smoked, it creaked with iron and wood, and waited for those who were small enough, cheap enough, and inconspicuous enough. For poor children, work was not an option. It was an extension of the street, only with a roof over their heads and longer hours. Factories opened their doors early, even before dawn. When the city was just starting to move, children were already standing at the machines. Their hands were small. And that is why they were needed. They crawled where an adult could not. Under cars, between belts, into narrow aisles where the traffic never stopped. Fingers quickly learned pain, skin to burns, back to strain. Crying did not stop the mechanisms. Children worked in textile factories, in workshops, in warehouses, on the docks. They pulled, pushed, cleaned, carried. Sometimes they fell. No one counted the hours. Only day, only night, only shift. Sleep was short. Food was monotonous. Light was artificial. Some worked in match factories. The air there was heavy, chemical, invisible, but constant. Faces turned yellow. Teeth were wobbly. The smell did not wash away. The children did not know that it was a slow poison. They only knew that work gives a few coins and another day of life. Others worked on the street, but no longer as beggars. They sold newspapers, flowers, matches, shouted headlines that they didn't read, offered small things to people who didn't look them in the face. In the evening, the voices disappeared. Throats hurt, legs trembled, and the city moved on. For many children, work was temporary, while they had strength, while their bodies obeyed. Then the street would welcome them back, worn out, quieter, older than their age. Some children ended up in workhouses precisely because of work. Trauma, exhaustion, illness. There, they were once again explained that work is the path to correction, to order, to usefulness. But none of these paths led to childhood. Schools existed, but not for everyone. Education cost time, and time was a luxury. Poor children learned something else: to wait, to endure, to be silent. They learned early on that fatigue is no reason to stop, that pain is no reason to complain, that there will always be a replacement. Sometimes a child disappeared from the factory, Another took its place, smaller, thinner. The wheel did not stop. The city grew, the owners got richer. Newspapers wrote about progress. And somewhere between these lines grew children who did not remember a day without work. For them, adulthood did not come. It simply continued. And when they found themselves on the street again, they were no longer children, but neither were they adults. They became part of the urban background, shadows, figures without history. Thus, the work that was supposed to save became another path to oblivion. And it was from these factories, workshops, and docks that those who would later sit in dark alleys with an outstretched hand and a gaze that no longer expects anything, workhouses. A relief that broke for Victorian society. Poverty was a problem that needed to be sorted out, not understood, not alleviated, but made manageable. And so, workhouses appeared. They stood apart from the rich areas, often behind walls, often with heavy gates that closed earlier than they seemed. From the outside, they looked stern but decent. Brick, windows, official signs. But inside, it was a different world. A workhouse was not a shelter in the usual sense. It was a system, a mechanism. A place where poverty had to become so unbearable that people were afraid to return. The principle was simple. Life inside had to be worse than life on the street. Then, it was believed, the poor would start working harder, and begging would disappear on its own. Those who came to the gate did so reluctantly, often after much hesitation, after hunger, after cold, after illness, because entry meant much more than shelter and food. Families were immediately separated, men in one building, women in another, children separately, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Names were changed to numbers, clothes to the same uniform. Personal belongings disappeared. There was no privacy here. There was no silence for thoughts. There was no opportunity to be yourself. The day began early. The bell, getting up, lineups. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Stone splinters, untying ropes, washing, cleaning. Food, simple, poor, repetitive. Porridge, bread, water. Sometimes soup. Always little. Conversations were discouraged. Complaints punished. Tears ignored. Children were taught discipline, but not care. Obedience, but not understanding. For many, this is where childhood finally disappeared. Some tried to escape, but escape was followed by punishment. Solitary cells, deprivation of food, humiliation, and again, silence. Workhouses justified themselves with numbers. Reports spoke of order, of efficiency, of the reduction of begging. But behind every number, there were people who came out of there, quieter, more broken, more empty. Some stayed forever. The old, the sick, those who no longer had the strength to return even to the street. For them, the workhouse became their last home, without choice, without warmth, without a name. And yet, despite their fear, people returned, because sometimes the cold walls seemed less cruel than the city's indifference. The workhouses did not eliminate poverty. They only hid it behind walls and rules. And when people went back into the world, they already knew that help could be another form of punishment. Thus, the city calmed itself. The system worked. Order was maintained. and the shadows returned to the streets. Disease, cold, and slow disappearance. Poverty in Victorian London rarely came alone. It almost always brought cold with it, and with cold came disease. It was a chain that was almost never broken. The winters were long, damp. Fog descended on the city like a heavy blanket, and the dampness seeped everywhere, into clothes, into bones, into lungs. For those who had a home, the cold was an inconvenience. For those who lived on the streets, it was a sentence. The beggars did not freeze immediately. They got used to it. The body learned to endure, to shorten its movements, to conserve heat as a last resort. But the cold worked slowly. It did not kill suddenly. It took away strength day by day. My fingers went numb. My legs ached. The cough became constant, and at some point, the body stopped resisting. Diseases spread quickly. Narrow alleys, crowded basements, shared blankets, the same bowls. Tuberculosis, fevers, infections that had no names for those who had them. Children coughed just like adults, sometimes more. Their bodies were smaller, thinner, less able to withstand losses. Mothers watched as their children weakened and could do nothing. Medicines cost money. Time cost money. Neither of these existed. Some of the sick tried to get to hospitals, but hospitals were not asylums. They didn't take everyone in, and not for long. Those who had no address were often sent back, into the fog, into the cold, into the same alleys. Others ended up in the workhouses when it was too late. There they were put in beds previously occupied by others. The air was heavy with breathing. The walls were cold. The silence was profound. Death was not an event here. It was part of the schedule. Nobody stopped work. Nobody changed the rules. A place would become vacant, and someone else would take it. On the streets, things were even quieter. A person could be sitting in the same place they had been seen yesterday. Yesterday, they would be reaching out. Today, they would just be sitting. Tomorrow, they would be gone. Sometimes a body would be found, sometimes not. Newspapers rarely mentioned such deaths. They were not news. They had no sensation. They had no names. The cold blurred the line between the living and the dead, especially at night. People fell asleep, pressed against the walls, under the stairs, in corners, where the wind was weaker. Not everyone woke up. Those who survived became slower. They spoke less. They moved less often. Their gaze changed. It became distant, as if the person was no longer here, but somewhere close to disappearing. The disease did not always kill. Often it simply took away the opportunity to work, and without work, only the street remained. Thus poverty closed in a circle. Cold, illness, weakness, street, cold. And it was almost impossible to get out of it. The city knew about it, but it was used to it. The smells, the coughs, the silhouettes that didn't move. All of this became the background, a noise that was no longer noticed. And yet, despite the illness, despite the cold, despite death, people held on. Not because they hoped, but because they were used to living one day at a time, to find a little warmth, to last another night, to live until morning. And if morning came, that was already an achievement. So the poor of Victorian London did not disappear all at once. Not loudly, not suddenly. They disappeared slowly. Between coughs and cold, between fog and stone, between the indifferent steps of those who passed by, and the city continued to live. Morality and guilt. Why the poor were guilty. In Victorian society, poverty was rarely seen as an accident. It was almost never seen as a tragedy. It was explained differently. Poverty was interpreted as a consequence, not of circumstance, but of character. If a person was poor, it meant that he had failed somewhere. He was not hardworking enough, not restrained enough, not moral enough. This idea was convenient. It removed responsibility. It allowed the city to move on, without stopping, without looking back. Sermons spoke of work as a virtue, of patience as the path to salvation, of humility as proof of worthiness. The poor were urged to accept their fate, humbly, silently, without question. Newspapers wrote about the dangerous classes, about people who supposedly threatened order, about beggars as potential criminals. One thing was read between the lines: their situation is their fault. This view permeated everywhere, in the courts, in hospitals, in charitable organizations. Even help often began with condemnation. Before receiving food or shelter, a person was questioned, checked, doubted. Is she really in need? Isn't she cheating? Doesn't she deserve her situation? Compassion became conditional. Women were judged especially harshly. Motherhood without marriage, loneliness, lost reputation. A woman who found herself on the street was considered not only poor, but morally corrupt. Her story was not listened to. Her past was not of interest. That was enough of a fact. Children inherited this condemnation automatically. They were called vicious from birth. It was as if poverty was passed down with the blood. Thus the belief was formed that helping was dangerous, because helping supposedly encouraged laziness. It was better to teach fear. It was better to make the life of the poor so difficult that others would not imitate them. Workhouses, vagrancy laws, strict rules. All this had not only a practical, but also a moral purpose: to set an example, to punish, to warn, and at the same time to cleanse the conscience of society. For if poverty is a fault, then compassion is no longer a duty. It becomes a choice, rare, inconvenient. This is how distance arose, between those who had a home and those who had lost it, between us and them. This distance was not physical. It was internal. You could walk past a beggar and not feel anything, because in your imagination he was already explained, justified, guilty. But sometimes this system cracked. Sometimes the gaze lingered. Sometimes the story didn't fit the pattern. Sometimes it became clear not everything was that simple. Some began to doubt, write, speak, deny. But such voices drowned in the general chorus of morality, which loved order more than people. And yet, even in this harsh world, there were those who felt discomfort, because too many people disappeared too quietly. Too many children had no choice. Too many lives were not invested in the simple explanation of, it was their own fault. And it was from this doubt that the first cracks in the empire's confidence began to appear. For when guilt becomes too convenient, it ceases to be truth. Charity and the limits of compassion. In Victorian London, charity was everywhere, and yet not for everyone. It was spoken about from pulpits, it was written about in newspapers, it was demonstrated at meetings, in reports, in speeches. But between words and life lay silence. Charity had rules. It was not unconditional. It began with the question, does this person deserve help? In a sermon in one of the London churches in 1849, the words were heard, "Charity without discretion is not a blessing, but a temptation. Help should elevate, not encourage vice." These words were repeated often. They soothed the conscience. Because help was allowed in limited quantities, selected, with verification. It looked different on the streets. Here is a man named Thomas, a former dock worker. He was in his 40s. He had lost his job after a shoulder injury. His arm could no longer lift as it had before. Thomas stood by the bridge, every day, in the same place. Sometimes he would get a coin, sometimes he wouldn't. The Morning Chronicle wrote, "Among the beggars there are some who abuse the trust of good citizens by pretending to be crippled." Thomas couldn't read, but he could feel the words, in their looks, in their gestures, in the quick steps that passed him. Another story is about a woman named Elizabeth, a widow, 3 children. The youngest was 5. She was applying to a charity. She was listened to attentively. They took notes. They asked questions. Was the husband a drunkard? Had she worked before marriage? Did she attend church? Help was possible, but temporary, limited. One of the charity committee's brochures stated, "Help should be restrained so as not to replace work and not to destroy moral independence." Elizabeth received bread and a blanket for a few weeks. Then nothing. Her story was no longer urgent. Others appeared. There were children, too. Little Jack sold matches near the station. He was 9. He knew how to smile. He knew when to be silent. Sometimes a lady would stop. She would give him a coin. She would say something like, "Poor child," and then she went on. Newspapers of the time often wrote, "Child begging is an alarming sign of the moral decay of the lower classes." No one wrote about the night, about the cold, about where Jack slept. Charity loved numbers. How much was given away, how much was fed, how many were saved. But it rarely stopped at faces. There were missions, shelters, soups. They helped without a doubt, but they could not change the main thing, attitude. Because help was always accompanied by supervision, control, moral evaluation. Those who did not fit in remained outside. Sometimes charity became a stage, a public gesture, proof of virtue, and those who were helped became the background. In one of the London magazines in 1862, a line appeared, "We must care for the poor, but not let them forget their place." It was said calmly, without malice, as if it were obvious. And that was precisely the danger, because compassion, limited by conditions, ceases to be compassion. It becomes a procedure. Some people refused help, not out of pride, but out of fatigue, tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of answering questions that do not save. So many returned to the street, to where nothing needed to be explained, only to survive. And yet, amidst this system, there were some people, priests, doctors, teachers, who saw things differently. They wrote letters. They spoke. They doubted. There were few of them, but they left a testimony, because without them, the history of charity would remain only a list of good intentions. and not a history of people who stood between help and the cold. Police, laws, and the right to be invisible. In Victorian London, order was valued above all else. The order of the streets, the order of traffic, the order of the appearance of the city. And that is why poverty was considered a problem not only moral, but also administrative. It had to be regulated. Laws against vagrancy existed long before the Victorian era, but it was in the 19th century that they became part of everyday life. Being homeless meant being under suspicion. The police were not looking for crime. They were looking for signs of disorder. A person could be stopped for standing for a long time. What about sitting on the stairs? What about sleeping in the porch? The questions were short. The answers were dangerous. Where do you live? Where do you work? Why are you here? A wrong answer meant arrest. Night patrols were regular. The police moved slowly, flashlights gliding along walls, faces, shadows. They knew these streets. They knew where people usually hid. They knew where it was warmer, drier, where you could survive the night. And that's where they went. The poor weren't always beaten. They weren't always shouted at. More often, they were just lifted. "You can't be here." This sentence was often heard, and almost always without explanation. The arrest was not loud. No shackles, no crowd. The person was taken away quietly, so as not to disturb the peace of others. Police stations were full at night. Tight rooms, benches, walls that remembered many breaths. The detainees were recorded, sometimes superficially, sometimes without names at all. For the system, they were temporary. A night in a cell was not officially a punishment. It was a means of cleaning the streets. In the morning, someone was released. Someone was sent further, to the court, to the workhouse, or back to the same streets. The courts worked quickly. Decisions were made in minutes. Vagrancy, violation of public order, suspicious behavior. These formulations were sufficient. The punishment often became several days of imprisonment, or forced labor, or deportation from the district. No one asked where a person should go next. The nights in winter were especially cruel. Then the police acted more actively, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Bodies freezing in the streets disturbed order, raised questions, spoiled the picture. It was better to take a person to a cell than to let them die before our eyes. The cells were cold, stone, without blankets, without comfort. But they gave one thing: a temporary appearance of care. For many beggars, arrest became part of the rhythm. Street, arrest, cell, street again. A cycle from which there was no way out. People learned to be invisible, hide better, move more quietly, sleep shorter. Not because they were afraid of crime, but because they were afraid of order. Order did not tolerate interruptions. He could not stand shadows that did not fit in. And yet, even in this system, there were sometimes moments of silence. A policeman passing by, a lantern that turned away, footsteps that moved on. It was not kindness, it was fatigue, because even those who kept order saw the same thing night after night, and they understood. The problem did not disappear. Laws could remove a person from the street, but they could not give him a place. Thus, the right to exist was transformed into the right to be unnoticed. And those who learned this best survived, not because of the law, but in spite of it. Night, food, and the quiet rules of survival. Night in Victorian London began long before darkness. It began when the city stopped watching. Shops closed. Carriages disappeared from the main streets. Windows went out one by one. And at that moment, the street changed owners. Those who had no home came out of the shadows, not to be noticeable, but to find a place. The first rule of the night was simple: never stay in one place. The police knew the habits. They knew the entrances. They knew the stairs where someone was always trying to spend the night. So the beggars moved, slowly, without a goal, but with a memory. Memory knew where the wind was weaker, where the stone was warmer, where the lantern doesn't shine directly. The shelters weren't shelters in the full sense. They were compromises. An arch under a bridge where the rain didn't seep in. A hollow between houses. An empty entrance to a warehouse that hadn't been locked yet. A place for the night wasn't chosen. It was accepted if it remained free. Lying down was dangerous, too visible. That's why many people sat up, backs pressed against the wall, slept in bits. Sleep was never deep. Any sound could mean the end of peace. Food was a different struggle. Not daily, constant. It wasn't sought after. It was expected. Leftovers from the markets, stale bread, vegetables that were no longer for sale. They often gathered at bakeries before they closed. They didn't ask. They waited. Sometimes the baker would come out. He would throw a few pieces without saying a word. Sometimes, no. The children knew these hours better than the adults. They knew when waste appeared, when you could pick something up without attracting attention. The food wasn't warm, but it was. They drank water wherever they could, from the speakers, from the fountains, sometimes from the river, if there was nothing else left. They didn't think about cleanliness. They thought about today. Mutual aid existed, but it was silent. Nobody made rules. They just showed up. A newcomer was noticed immediately, by their movements, by their fear, by their lack of understanding of the rhythm. They could show him where it was better not to sleep, where not to sit, where it was dangerous, not out of kindness, but from experience. Food was sometimes shared, especially if there was a little more of it than for one. But more often, everyone had their own. Conflicts occurred less often than outsiders expected. Poverty did not have the strength for war. The strength went to other things, to preserve the place, to memorize the routes, to avoid glances. The children often stuck together, not always relatives, not always friends. It was just warmer together, and less scary. The older ones sometimes watched the younger ones, not officially, not constantly, but if something happened, someone noticed. She taught silently at night. She did not give advice. It filtered out. Those who didn't learn disappeared faster. Those who stayed became part of the city at night. They knew when to go out onto the main street, when to disappear, when to wait for morning. Morning was a reward, not a promise, simply a fact. You survived another night, and that was enough. Because for those who lived between arrests, between cold and hunger, survival was not a story. It was routine. Voices that were still heard in the late 19th century, Victorian London began to change. Not dramatically, not loudly, and not for everyone at once. The changes began not in the streets, but in words. There were those who stopped looking past. Journalists, doctors, teachers, priests who could no longer remain silent. They walked the same alleys, they saw the same faces, but instead of turning away, they wrote. One reporter wrote about night patrols, about children who sleep sitting up, about people who disappear without a trace, not as a sensation, but as a fact. These texts did not always please readers. They were inconvenient, slow, heavy, but they existed. And that was how the first cracks began to appear in the idea of poverty as guilt. Doctors began to talk about illnesses that were not a consequence of character, about exhaustion, about cold, about bodies that simply couldn't take it. They wrote reports. They reported to committees. They emphasized the problem was not morality, but conditions. Some listened, some didn't. Change never comes to everyone at once. Charity began to change form. Shelters appeared that didn't demand explanations, kitchens that didn't ask questions. They didn't solve the problem, but they saved days, sometimes nights. Gradually, laws changed too, not out of mercy, but out of awareness. A city that ignores its own shadows sooner or later stumbles over them. And it is important to stop here, because this story is not only about the past. As the producer of this story, I deliberately do not show loud scenes. There are no screams. There are no heroes. There are no climaxes. Because the life of the poor of Victorian London was exactly that. Slow, difficult, invisible. This story is not created to impress. It is created to stay. Each chapter is not an event, but a state in which people have lived for years. A state that is easy to miss if you look quickly. That is why pace is important. Pause is important. Silence is important. Because only in silence are these voices heard. By the end of the Victorian era, poverty did not disappear. It simply changed form. Some children went to school. Some workhouses closed. Some laws were relaxed. But the shadows remained. They moved on to another century, to other cities, to other forms. And that is why this story has no ending in the classical sense. It does not end in victory or defeat. It ends in a realization. The realization that behind every statistic, there are people. Behind every order, there are those it did not take into account. Behind every empire, there are streets that did not make it into the textbooks. When a city forgets, but memory remains. Cities have the ability to forget. Not abruptly, not intentionally, but gradually. Streets change names, buildings, functions, alleys, shape. Where people once stood with outstretched hands, shop windows appear. Where people spent the night under arches, new routes are laid. And it seems that nothing is left. Victorian London has experienced many changes. Industrial noise has been replaced by a different rhythm. Gas lamps have given way to electricity. Factories have disappeared or become museums. The city has become cleaner, brighter, more organized. But memory does not disappear with the bricks. It remains in the irregularities of the stone, in the shapes of the streets, which for some reason are so narrow, in the strange curves of neighborhoods where it was once convenient to disappear. People who lived on the edge rarely leave behind monuments. Their names are not engraved on facades. They are not mentioned in celebratory speeches, but they were. And this knowledge is not always comfortable, because the memory of the poor reminds that the city never belonged to everyone equally. Those who survived often disappeared from history once again, in documents, in statistics, in silence. Children who grew up on the streets became adults without biographies, without records, without inheritance. Their lives had no beginning or end in official books, only duration. Sometimes someone remembered. An old resident of the district, a letter to the newspaper, a memory in a diary. But most of the stories were never told. The city moved forward because that was its destiny. Progress does not stop to look back. And yet, memory has its own ways of remaining. It lives in the atmosphere, in the feeling when you walk down the street and suddenly feel something heavy, for no reason. It lives in the silence that seems too deep for such a noisy place. These are not ghosts. These are not mysticism. These are traces. Traces of a life that was not recorded but lived. Sometimes memory appears in words, in books, in slow stories that are not in a hurry. Because hurry is also a form of forgetting. When we listen to such stories, we do not return to the past. We merely acknowledge its existence, and that is enough. Because acknowledgement is the opposite of disappearance. A city can change its face, but it cannot completely erase what made it what it is. Every step over a stone is a step over another life, another night, another cold. And if we walk slowly, we feel it. That is why memory is not always loud. It does not require scenes. It does not require emotions. It is simply present. And when a city forgets, that presence becomes more important, because it reminds us that which was not noticed does not mean that it did not happen. The story of the poor of Victorian London does not end here. It has no clear end date. It dissolves, transitions, changes, but memory remains with those who are willing to listen slowly. Silence after footsteps. The night returns to where we started. London sleeps. Not deeply, not completely. But as cities sleep, between sounds, between light and darkness. The streets are emptier than they were. The gaslights are long gone. But the stone still remembers the warmth of the hands that touched it on cold nights. Now there are different footsteps, a different rhythm, a different time. But if you stop, if you take your time, you can feel the same air, heavy, slow, full of traces. We have not walked this story to find an end, and not to pass a sentence. We have walked it to be near, near those who were not heard, who was not remembered, who was not written down. These people did not leave behind loud words. They left only a presence, the one that does not disappear when the light goes out. And now, as the night grows deeper, you can allow this presence to slowly dissolve. Let the footsteps fall silent. Let the streets become just streets again. Let the story lie next to others without demanding attention. Because some stories do not want to end. They want silence. If you have listened until this point, thank you for your time, for your slowness, for your willingness to take your time. If these stories help you fall asleep, calm down, or just be in silence, support the channel with a subscription and a quiet comment. This helps these voices remain heard. And now you can let go of the day. Let the night be even. Breathing slow. Thoughts quiet. We have already left, and the city remains asleep.